Which brings us to our sermon series that is Loving. And today we are talking about a story that took place 2,000 years ago on a hillside overlooking the Sea of Galilee, which if you went there today, it would look something like this. Jesus began to preach a sermon that would later be known as the Sermon on the Mount. And about a third of the way through the sermon, he said to the people gathered on this hillside, "You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor." Now, because Jesus is speaking to a Jewish audience, the Jews would know immediately where Jesus got this from. The book of Leviticus, where God spoke from this tent to Moses and gave Moses all sorts of commandments and rules for what it meant to be a holy people. One of these commandments was God saying to Moses, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself." So when Jesus says, you have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor, everyone would have thought, oh, he's talking about Leviticus. Then Jesus goes on to say, and hate your enemy. Now, there is no verse in the Bible that says hate your enemy, but there are several verses that are very close. And in my opinion, the strongest one is found in Psalm 139, which is personally my favorite psalm, except for a couple verses, which we'll talk about here. Psalm 139 is the psalm that talks about how we are fearfully and wonderfully made and how God knew me and formed me and God understood who I was. Psalm 139 then turns a dark turn when David says, "Do I not hate those who hate you, O Lord? And do I not loathe those who rise up against you? I hate them with perfect hatred. I count them my enemies." So Jesus says, you have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor, which is a quote from Scripture, and hate your enemy, which is a paraphrase. But then Jesus decides to turn the phrase on its head by saying to them, but I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Now, I have a feeling that people, when they heard this, thought to themselves, oh no, he's not talking about them, is he? And they sort of lean forward because they say to themselves, surely he's not going to deep six this entire sermon by telling us that we need to love those people, right? So Jesus continues, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven, for God makes God's sun rise on the evil and on the good and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. Now, this may seem like an innocuous statement to you, but I have to tell you, this was a revolutionary theological idea in Jesus' day. The reason for this is because if you go back before the scientific method, there was this sense that when a drought occurred, the only reason was because God was angry with you. After all, God is in charge of sending the rains here and there, and the winds blow there and there. If God wants a drought to occur in a spot, then God would will it to be so. So if you were experiencing a drought, you would assume that God was angry with you. Conversely, if you got lots of rain in one year and you saw that it was easy for crops to grow, you would assume that you were doing something right as a nation, right? You would assume that God was very happy with you, so the rain was viewed as a blessing. And then along comes Jesus, and he challenges this whole idea by saying God makes God's sun rise on the evil and on the good, but also sends rain on the righteous and on the unrighteous. In other words, Jesus says, God doesn't give you rain just because you earned it. Now, I imagine those people who have those questions in the back of their mind thinking to themselves, oh no, he's doing it. I am afraid that he's talking about them. And then in the very next verse, Jesus says, for if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And at this point, everyone says he is talking about them. Tax collectors. I knew it. And they can't believe he's talking about tax collectors because everyone who was listening to this sermon most likely hated tax collectors. Now, to understand why that is, we have to talk a little bit about the context of Jesus saying these words. And you have to go back to this time in first century Judea because first century Judea was under the jurisdiction of the Roman Empire. Now, the way the Romans collected taxes is through a system called tax farming, which if you look this up on Google Images, you will always find the shape of a pyramid because this is an ancient pyramid scheme. Now, at the top, you've got a governor who we'll call Maximus, who's a Roman governor of a province, and he oversees different people, like people in first century Judea, and these people have to pay tax to the Roman Empire. Let's pick two brothers. We're going to pick their names are Nadab and Abihu. So Nadab and Abihu have to pay taxes to Maximus. Maximus decides, okay, they owe $3,000 each. This will increase the funds of the Roman Empire by $6,000. Now, Maximus is obviously too big of a deal to go and collect these taxes. So Maximus says, we're going to have an auction for Roman citizens. Whoever wants to buy the rights to tax Nadab and Abihu, we're going to sell it to the highest bidder. So Commodus shows up, and Commodus, assuming if there were dollars, shows up and he essentially bids for the right to collect taxes from the people of Judea. Now, let's just make up a number. Let's say he pays $75,000 to have the right to collect taxes from Nadab and Abihu and the other people of first century Judea. He wins it, he wins the contract, and of course, he's going to try to recover his costs. So on top of $6,000, Commodus wants another $3,000 for these two people, so he gets $3,000, and their tax bill, Nadab and Abihu, jumps to $4,500. Now, eventually, Nadab and Abihu keep paying more and more taxes. They are being driven into poverty. I've seen estimates as low as 70% of Jews in first century Palestine, 70% of their income was taxed, up to 90%. That's the highest estimates I've seen. And eventually it drives people into poverty, as you can imagine. Well, once they are at their most desperate, Commodus goes to Nadab and says, hey, I see you're having a hard time feeding your family. What if I paid you to be a tax collector? What if you came and worked for the Roman Empire and you worked for me and we sent you to go collect taxes from people like your brother Abihu? And Nadab looks at his family and says, no, I could never do this. And then he says, you know what? I don't have many other choices. So he agrees to be Commodus's tax collector, and Commodus gets something very valuable in return. He protects himself from revolts by the Jewish peasants, because Abihu is not going to fight against his brother Nadab. It would bring severe dishonor to his family, right? And so Nadab now stands between the Roman Empire and Abihu as a buffer for safety for Commodus. And Nadab here, at this point, they could say to him, hey, Commodus would say, Nadab, look, as much as you want to charge to collect taxes, I don't care as long as I get my $3,000, and then we also get the $6,000 to pass up to Maximus. So Nadab, who's poor now, goes to his brother Abihu, who is also poor, and says, I'm now a tax collector. I need you to pay $4,500, but I also need to make something, so you got to give me $1,500. And you can imagine the frosty exchange the first time a brother showed up to collect tax from a brother, but at the same time, Nadab is now backed up by the empire, and Abihu has to pay it. Now, Abihu would not violently revolt against his brother, but he and his family and his friends would all do the same protest in response to Nadab selling his soul to the Roman Empire. They would leave him alone and force him into social isolation. They were not allowed to come to birthday parties anymore. They had to spend holidays alone. And yes, Nadab all of a sudden became rich and brought his family out of poverty, but he did it all alone. And the only friends were other tax collectors who were willing to tax their friends and family. And so when Jesus mentions tax collectors here in the context of love your enemies, he's really specifically talking to these people about how they need to love their tax collector. And when you look at Jesus standing up in front of these people who all have one thing in common, they all hate tax collectors, and he's saying, do you really want to be on the same level as tax collectors? Do you really want to say, well, I love the people who love me? Because he's like, even tax collectors can do that, guys. I'm asking you to be something more. He goes on to ask the question, and if you greet only your brothers and sisters, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the non-religious do the same? Be perfect, therefore, Jesus says, as your heavenly Father is perfect. Jesus then moves on to the second part of his sermon and leaves this idea alone. Now, it's important for us to understand what is going on here. When Jesus asks people to love their enemies, he is not speaking in general terms. In this sermon, Jesus asked people to love their specific enemies. And what that means is if you could imagine Jesus coming to speak at Paradox today, I have to ask the question to myself and also to you, what specific enemy of yours would Jesus ask you to love today? And I have to tell you that when I ask this question out loud, it's even hard for me to get it out of my mouth because I have a confession to make. I don't like loving my enemies. I don't enjoy loving my enemies. I kind of want the worst thing possible to happen to my enemies, right? And the fact is, I look out at all of you, and there are some very kind, wonderful people here, and I'm thinking to myself, I might be the worst person here to talk about loving enemies. I might have the worst qualifications and the worst track record. I don't know if I'm good at this. And I didn't really know how to approach this subject until recently I read a book by Barbara Brown Taylor, who is an ordained minister in the Episcopalian tradition. She was talking about what it was like to be ordained, and she paraphrased some advice from one of her friends. And she said, being an ordained minister is not about serving God perfectly, but about serving God visibly, allowing other people to learn whatever they can from watching you rise and also watching you fall. So I hope that what this comes across as when we talk about loving our enemies is not me standing on a stage saying like, come on, you guys, get on my level. Instead, I hope it comes across as you and I sitting at a coffee shop saying, isn't it awful that Jesus asked us to love our enemies? Because I'm not sure how to do this. And if you are in that moment, and we were sitting in that moment together at a coffee shop over coffee, and we talked about the pain or the heartache that our enemies have caused us, and then we turn to each other, or you turn to me and say, like, what have you learned about loving your enemies? I would say, first of all, it's not easy. And second of all, I've learned a few things, but I'm not sure they're all the right answer. So for the rest of this sermon, or this conversation over coffee, I want to share with you what I have learned in 39 years of attempting to love my enemies. So if we go back to this time, Jesus stands up here and says, love your enemies, do whatever you can to pray for those who persecute you. Now, I have to tell you, growing up in church and growing up in religion and also going to be a minister, I've heard these words, but I've also read my own interpretation into those words. While Jesus has said those exact things, I've heard other things like this. If you follow my teachings, then you will not have any enemies. It's almost like I hear Jesus implying that in his teaching, even though Jesus doesn't say it. I've also heard Jesus say, in God's eyes, there is no such thing as enemies. Act accordingly. Or I've heard Jesus say, avoid making your neighbor your enemy at all costs. I have some good news for us this morning. Jesus doesn't say any of those things. Jesus acknowledges a reality that you and I will face, and the fact that if you are human, at some point, you will have enemies. And I have to tell you that I am an ordained minister with a doctorate degree in religious studies, and I have enemies. And I know pastors aren't supposed to admit this out loud because pastors are supposed to love everyone, but I am a human being just like you. And when Jesus says in front of everybody, hey, you're going to have enemies, it's okay. Try to learn how to love them. I have to look at what Jesus is really telling us, which is no matter how loving I am, I will still have enemies. And that's okay. It's okay if you've made somebody angry. It happens. It's part of being human. Not only that, but we also have to acknowledge the history of what it means to tell someone else to love your enemies. Jesus did not speak in a vacuum. He spoke to a specific context. And if you think about who Jesus was actually in this hierarchy with made-up names. Jesus was a poor peasant being taxed by tax collectors like Matthew to feed the Roman Empire. It is in this position that Jesus says, love your tax collector. Notice how different this would be if Jesus was himself a tax collector. If he showed up in Judea and said, hey, let me tell you who God is. God wants you to love your tax collector. Everyone would say, get out of here, man. That's ridiculous. How different would it be if Jesus was a Roman governor and he rolled in on a chariot and then declared an edict, you shall love your tax collector. No one would listen to him. But the fact is, Jesus is down here speaking to people like Abihu, whose own brother has sold him out, and he's telling him horizontally, we should learn how to love these guys because this current system of social isolation is just making things worse. I tell you all of this because when I talk about what I've learned about attempting to love my enemy, I've found that my enemy does not get to tell me that I need to love my enemy. If anyone here has an enemy that says, hey, aren't you a Christian? Shouldn't you love me? Shouldn't you love your enemy? Don't allow them to do that. That's against the rules. Conversely, it also means that I do not get to go tell my enemy that they need to love me. This is much more of a personal journey than it is using an external law to bend others to your will. Now, as far as the context behind this, Jesus specifically talks about tax collectors. And I have to tell you, I personally don't have a problem with tax collectors. I've never seen anybody walk into the IRS building and thought to myself, oh man, that's my enemy, right? But if you look at what Jesus was doing, he was speaking about an injustice for his day. And this world is filled with all kinds of injustice, isn't it? There's war, there's greed, there's anger, there's racism, there's homophobia, there's misogyny. There's all these different injustices that are real realities. And when we look at those things, there's always this temptation to look at Jesus saying, love my enemies or love your enemies, and think to yourself, you know what? He doesn't understand what I went through. He doesn't understand how bad this enemy is. And when we do that, we actually dismiss the suffering that Jesus and those Jewish peasants went through 2,000 years ago. We try to get into a competition and say, well, my suffering's so much worse. And at the same time, you look at other people who have had worse suffering than you, and it's rather surprising to see them say things like, I have found that the most valuable thing in times of war is to learn how to love my enemies. That is nearly a direct quote from the Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who lived through apartheid and the genocide of Rwanda. He lived through it, and he still talks about forgiveness and the value of loving enemies, having seen the worst that humanity has to offer. Not only that, but I have to tell you, I know there are a lot of bad things that people do to each other. And yet what I have found is in the worst stories of humanity, there are stories of redemption and people rising above what is bad to discover something good. What I've learned about loving my enemies is that while there is a lot of pain in loving our enemies, I have found that there is no sin beyond the redemption of God. I have found that no matter how much of a problem has been created by enemies, there is nothing that God cannot redeem and make something better out of. I have found that no matter how bad something is, you can always find a life that is bigger than just that thing. That sin, that anger, that pain does not have to define you for the rest of your life. And when I think about growing up in church, I went to a lot of church services. I was really committed to the church message. I was really committed to following God. And if anybody would have asked me for the majority of my life, up until about 25, Craig, how is it that you know you're a Christian? I would have said things like, I don't drink, I don't cheat, I don't do this thing, I don't do that thing. Now, I've started answering that question very differently. And when people ask me, how do you know you're a Christian? I would say, look, I'm really bad at this, but I know I'm a Christian because I keep coming back to this commandment, and I found that no matter how bad they are to me, I will still try to love my enemies. Now, you may think that I'm overemphasizing this commandment and overemphasizing this as a marker of what it means to be Christian. But I get this directly from the words of Jesus when he says, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. In other words, if you want to be a child of God, the best way is to go out and love your enemies. That's the path of where God is leading us. And when I think about what Jesus is saying here, I think we can place this much emphasis on this commandment. The value of my Christian faith is measured by the way that I treat my enemies. That's how I know how much of a Christian I am. And if that sounds daunting to you, I want you to know it's daunting to me as well. I don't want you to see how I treat my enemies. I'd much rather have you see how I treat the people who love me, because that's where I really nail it, right? I do a much better job in that department than in the way that I treat my enemies. And this is a really difficult ask for Christians. It's so difficult, in fact, that when I hear Christians talk about heaven, it's almost like they view heaven as an escape hatch to get out of having to love their enemies. Because they have this sense that there will be some people who are in and some people who are out, and wouldn't you know it, all of their enemies in the Christian's mind are out, and all of their friends are in. So they say to God, I know you asked us to love your enemies, but I got to get the world ready for your soon return, and please come back soon so I don't have to spend time loving this person. And I understand why Christians do this, because loving our enemies is by far the most difficult task in the Christian tradition. There's nothing hard that Jesus asks of us. There's nothing more painful, more time-consuming, more just difficult to figure out than how it is that we love someone who is against us. Now, I have found that it would be much easier if my enemies walked around looking like enemies, so that way everyone would be like, that guy's an enemy. Can you imagine how easy it would be if my enemies walked around looking like this? Sauron from Lord of the Rings? They'd be like, who do you have a problem with? I'd be like, Sauron. They'd be like, me too, right? There's no way we don't have a problem with this guy. Imagine that our villains, the people who are enemies to us, looked like Gore the God Butcher or Darth Vader. It would be so much easier, right? Because when people say, like, why don't you like that guy? Let's say, look at the way they dress. I'm supposed to not like that guy. Now, there are times of war, and I've been fortunate enough to not live through those, and I'm grateful for whatever happened before that I can live in a time that is absent of war where something like this happens. But I have found that this is not my experience. Instead, I have found that the people I consider enemies are people who I once opened my arms wide to, and they have become my enemies shortly after that was rejected. Anytime we open our arms wide, we are exposing our vulnerabilities and opening ourselves to be hurt by someone. Now, that is a painful journey. And that painful journey often leads us to feel a deep sense of anger. And we have this idea that there's no way that we can be angry at our enemy if we're called to love our enemies. And I will tell you, I have not found that to be true. I have not found it to be true because of the philosophical film that came out about 10 years ago called Crazy Stupid Love. In this movie, the main character, played by Steve Carell, is given a speech, and he's given a speech to his wife in front of a bunch of people, and he's really had a hard time reconciling with her. And he gives this beautiful speech, and one of the main points of his speech is he says to his wife, I have loved my wife even when I hated her. Only married couples will understand that one. And I remember seeing that and being like, I don't want to say that I understand that one, but I think I do. And I wouldn't even say out loud that I hate my wife, but I will tell you, I have never stopped loving my wife even when I'm angry with her. And it's hard to believe, but she probably at some point in our marriage has been angry at me, right? I would guess that she would say that she did not stop loving me while she was angry with me. It is possible to love someone and be angry with them at the same time. Love your enemies should never be used to repress my emotions. It's okay to be angry. It's okay to be hurt. It's okay to feel betrayed by the whole thing and question whether or not God is actually good because of this. None of that is a violation of the command to love my enemies. Your emotions need to breathe and need to have space. And all of that is independent, in my opinion, from what it means to love one's enemies. I used to have this idea that to love an enemy that had really hurt me, the only way I could truly love them is if I invited them over to dinner at my house, and we had this big kumbaya moment where we started crying and we all apologized and we all got back on the same page. I have to tell you, I haven't found life to be that accommodating. Now, it's here that someone may say, Craig, but that's what Jesus did. He didn't invite tax collectors to his house, but he went to a tax collector named Zacchaeus and invited himself to Zacchaeus' house. To which I would say, of course he did. But it's important to remember the context that Jesus was in. Tax collectors were suffering from social isolation. So he had to go out and start breaking the barriers of that social isolation because he passionately believed this was the way forward to relating to and loving these tax collectors again. Now, my enemy is most likely not experiencing social isolation. For instance, a tax collector had to spend all the holidays alone, wasn't invited to birthday parties, wasn't part of any big announcement. The people I know as my enemies are part of their own social network. They're not dining alone every night. They've got friends, they've got birthday parties, they've got family members. They're all doing their thing, and it's not like they need that from me. And I think that's really important to draw this distinguishing line because what I have found to be true is that loving my enemy is not about my proximity to my enemy. Rather, it's about my posture toward my enemy. It's how I think about them, how I speak about them when they're not around. It's how I understand them. It's how I act toward them when I hear that something good happened to them. It's not about proximity. It's about my posture toward my enemy. And while there are enemies who sometimes fade away or get out of our lives completely, there are other enemies who are very much in our life, whether it's a family member or a close friend that you just can't seem to avoid. And some of the best advice I've ever received is to look at what it is that I am willing to hold and what it is that I am willing to let go. Because I will tell you, I've made a lot of mistakes in my life. I'm pretty sure that you have too. And I've learned that the more honest I can be about those mistakes and own the times that I messed up, the further I get things moving along to making things better. However, I've also done this thing where I've said that I'm sorry for things that I'm not actually sorry for, or I've owned up to things that I didn't actually mean or do, and I found that that never made things better. And so what I have learned is that I will always own what is mine, and I will also disown what is not. I will admit where I messed up, and if somebody else feels like I made a mistake that I don't feel like I did, I will not own up to that. Now, I have therapists and mentors who help me sort through when I've been wrong. I love them enough to tell me when I've been wrong, and I trust them to tell me. But I found this advice of owning what is yours and disowning what is not has been very helpful in processing how to love my enemies. Because I wish it was easier, right? I wish it was like sports events where we could go and say, oh, there's a clear winner and a clear loser. Those guys are the enemies because they're not dressed like us. We're this team together and we're fighting for the common good of our tribe. This is why I think sports is so appealing. It's very simple. You have a winner, you have a loser every time people step on the field, and it's very obvious what the objective is. But I have found what happens is that enemies often try to force us or force each other into win-lose scenarios, where there's a clear winner and a clear loser, and they're trying to be the winner, and you're trying to be and they're trying to make you the loser. I have found that most people try to respond with their own win-lose scenario or play their enemy's game and try to be the winner. I have not found that to be helpful. I believe that loving my enemy is responding to this with a win-win scenario. If you have the courage to be able to ask, what's a win for me and a win for them, it is both an opportunity to tell yourself that you are loving toward yourself and loving toward them. And it's a painful question to ask, but I have found it to be worthwhile every time. And you may look at this, you may say to yourself, have I done a good job at loving my enemy? I will tell you that's a very valuable question to ask. But whatever you do, do not allow certain people to grade your ability to love your enemy. Specifically, my enemy does not get to grade me on my ability to love them. If I based all of my ability to love them on their opinion, I would fail every time. Now, this may sound discouraging. We do make mistakes, but I love what Jesus says at the end of this passage when he says, be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. The thing about loving your enemy is you're playing a long-term game. There's not a lot of short-term games here. It's all about thinking way down in the future how you want to be remembered by your kids or your family or the ones that you love, and how you can respond to the best in a very difficult situation. Loving your enemy always, always, always takes patience. And along this journey, I will tell you that I have found that I often question whether or not loving my enemy is the right thing or not. And what I have found is that loving my enemy is a long-term solution, and this journey requires faith. And I say that specifically because I have to trust Jesus when Jesus says it's worthwhile to love your enemy. There are days I don't know if that's actually the case. And so I trust the words of Jesus, the teachings of Jesus, the ministry of Jesus, in order to believe that this is worth continuing to invest time in, even when I cannot see it on that journey. Now, I know a lot of people want to try to get out of this obligation as Christians to love their enemies. And so people love to label their enemies with certain adjectives. The one I've heard most recently over and over again is the word toxic. I've heard Christians use the word toxic to describe people a lot lately. Now, what's interesting is if you go to the American Psychological Association's dictionary, which they have one online, and you type in toxic or toxic person, you will get this response. Sorry, toxic person is not in the dictionary of psychology. Now, this is really stunning to me because I was sure that it was a label that psychologists love. But then I went to therapy with a psychologist, and I tried to label some people as toxic, and she was like, no, don't do that. And I said, I'm sorry, am I paying you or are you paying me? There's no such thing as a literally toxic person. So I tried other words with my therapist. I was like, well, this person is malicious. He's bad, she's bad, they're all bad. She's like, no, stop doing that. And I said, what do you mean? She's like, it will not help you to call someone malicious. It will not help you to call someone terrible. It will not help you to call them toxic. And I was like, what, are you serious? And she said, it will just make you angrier and write them off even more, and you will just be stuck in your anger. What I have learned is that labeling my enemy with terms that assume the worst about them does not help. But I have some good news. There is something that helps. And we got to go back about 200 years ago to the mid-19th century when a man named Robert Vischer, a German psychologist, introduced a brand new word to the German language. It's called Einfühlung. Let me hear you say Einfühlung this morning. That's better German than I have, that's for sure. This literally translates to English as feeling into. And while Vischer is the one that introduced it, someone later than him, a German psychologist, Theodor Lipps, came up with this word and started using this word in like really profound ways. It got the attention of an English psychologist, a man named Edward Titchener, and he was like, English needs an Einfühlung in their own language. Like, we're missing out by not having this. And so in 1909, Edward Titchener introduced a new word into the English language, empathy. First time it was used was in 1909. Now, his definition was the capacity of human beings to be in tune with another's emotions and to know and understand one another through reflection and shared experience. I tell you this because empathy is a brand new idea in modern consciousness. And while it may be jarring to hear Jesus say, love your enemies, I have a feeling that if Jesus was here today and speaking in English, he would come to Paradox and say, like, let's go out on a mountain and give a sermon there. So we go to the Appleton Ranch where we go every Easter, and Jesus would be preaching, and about a third of the way through, I think he'd be using English in this hypothetical situation. I think that he would change the wording just a little bit. I think he would say, love your enemies with empathy. I have found that empathy is the absolute best tool we have for understanding how to love our enemies. And that the path to loving our enemies is paved with empathy. Now, these are not big, grand gestures, right? It can be the tiniest shred of empathy you could possibly imagine. For instance, something along the lines of, wow, their marriage must be really tough right now. It could be something as simple as, I'm not sure they even understand why they're doing what they're doing. It can be as small as, I know how much stress they're dealing with the death of their father. I can understand why they do this. It doesn't excuse it. It's just a small understanding, and I will tell you this has been life-changing for me. I believe that empathy is the path to learning how to love our enemies. And so, my friends, my wish for you this morning is that you may have faith, and may your faith inspire you to trust the most difficult teaching of Jesus, and may you find the courage to love your enemies with empathy. Amen.